We are finally almost finished fixing our geometry so that it's ready to be fractured. We just need to do a final check of the attributes on it. So let's take all of our different separated sections and merge them back together. Grab the interior and the rings and the facade and the other rings and the window frames. And as before, I've mentioned that it's very important that we don't have unshared edges if we want to fracture these as solid pieces. So I'm going to do one last sanity check here, drop in a group, and turn off the base group, call this unshared. Should be used to this by now. Turn on edges and turn on unshared edges. And if we middle mouse, we can confirm there are no unshared edges, so that's all good. But if we look at the spreadsheet for our geometry, you can see, and maybe you've noticed this before as we've been working on it, there are some missing path attributes in here. You can see right away there are a few blank ones, and if you click on this path attribute name here, you can sort these rows by that attribute. So there are a ton of prims on this geometry that don't have that information. And as I've mentioned before, keeping the path attribute intact is very important. It might be used not only by effects, but also by other parts of the pipeline, particularly look dev and lighting. But thankfully, it's pretty straightforward to fix this path attribute. The reason some of those path attributes are missing is because when we do operations like, for example, our poly extrude here, the front and back faces will maintain all the same attributes, but the side faces won't necessarily pick up the prim attributes from the extrusion area. It would be nice if they did, but they don't, so we have to fix that. One technique that I've used to fix these missing path attributes is looping over each piece individually and transferring from the prims that have that attribute to the rest of the geometry. So let's drop in our for each named primitive and connect the merge to that. And then display the begin so we can see that it's successfully isolating one piece. And then let's delete all the prims that don't have a path attribute in them. So you can drop in a blast node, and because our path attribute typically has a slash in it, you can display the blast and say @path equals */*. And then we'll flip this to delete non-selected. Now to test and see if this is working, I'm actually going to flip this back off of delete non-selected, and we'll wire that into the end and display the end so we can see which pieces don't seem to have a path attribute applied. And sure enough, this looks like edges that would have been the sides of an extrusion, or maybe edges that were bridged like in the window fixing setup. And now that we verify that that blast is working as we expect it to, we can go back to the blast. Let's flip it so that it's only isolating pieces that do have a path attribute. Looks like our for each begin is now fetching a different individual piece, but that's fine. So we're isolating just the pieces that have that valid path. And now let's do an attribute transfer onto our full piece of geometry. We'll put the full piece of geometry in the first input of the transfer, the blasted out section in the second input, and then we'll wire that into the output. In this attribute transfer, you can select the attributes you want to consider. You could put star if you want to do everything, but that's pretty dangerous, at least if you don't know what you're doing. So I'm just going to explicitly select the path. And then under conditions here, we can turn off that distance threshold so that it can transfer that attribute regardless of how close one prim is to the prims you're transferring from. Now if we display the end of this and look at all of our geometry, let's check it out in the spreadsheet. Expand this out a little bit. we can then sort by our path attribute again. And sure enough, it looks like all of the empty values have been fixed. You can bypass that attribute transfer. You can see we've got the empties. Turn the transfer back on and it's all fixed. Of course, this is only showing us the spreadsheet for the piece that's currently selected in our network view, which is this attribute transfer. So if you want to see all of the geometry, then you have to select the end. Just one thing to watch out for when you're using this spreadsheet view, just to make sure you're viewing the spreadsheet on the correct node. Now our path's fixed, that's all good, and I'm checking the other attributes to make sure everything else looks right. And everything's good except this class attribute is probably unnecessary. So I'll go back to the scene view and drop in an attribute delete. And in that attribute delete, I will select the class, double check our attribute list, all is well, and then I'm going to finish up our geometry fixing by selecting that whole fixing network there and creating a box around it. It's just nice when we have a network that starts to get pretty long to have different logical sections visually grouped together like this, especially if somebody else is going to look at your file at any point. And I'll rename that box Geometry Fixing. And now we're all ready to move on toward carving out the area that we want to fracture and finally running a detailed fracture on it.